Hi everybody, it's Kelly from Wild Talks and Nature Walks again, and welcome to the first of my mini nature programs. Now this one was inspired from the video unboxing I did of the SD cards from our trail cameras, and on one of them we got to see something I have never seen in the wild before. I've never certainly caught it on video before, either film or digital, and that was a male white-tailed deer, a buck, that had just started shedding the outer layer of skin or velvet from his antlers once their growth is complete. And I thought I'd talk a little bit more about that. Now, antlers are different from animals that have horns. So animals like deer, elk, moose, reindeer, or caribou, all of those animals have antlers. And for the most part, those antlers are shed or lost once a year. The male deer or moose or elk will lose those antlers at the end of the breeding season, the rut, and they will, as the hormone levels drop, as I mentioned when we were looking at the videos, the bases of the antlers where they join the skull get brittle and they start to look spongy. They get look porous, all little holes and cavities in them, and as they get brittle and begin to disintegrate, it's easy for them to be lost. So a deer can be bounding through the woods and just jump and land hard or knock it up against a tree or some other surface. Sometimes they can shake their head and they'll just drop off. Now, very rarely do they drop off together at the same time, but normally when a buck drops one antler, within about 24 hours or so, the second antler drops and is shed. And what's left behind, as I mentioned, is a little raw place that looks like where a scab has been knocked off the surface of the skin. There's a little bit of blood there. It'll scab over and start to heal within 24 hours, and that's where the antlers begin to grow again from the deer skull in preparation for the next breeding season. So antlers are lost every year and regrown the next year for the next breeding season. So in that sense, they are kind of a renewable resource, I guess you'd call it. But they're also made of solid bone. Now, in contrast, animals like bison or bighorn sheep in North America, those are horns. And an animal that grows horns keeps the same set of horns its entire life. The horns grow from the inside out. The horns have a bony core on the interior of the horn that's covered with a layer of blood vessels that nourish the growth of the outer sheath or portion of the horn. And the outer portion of a horn is made of keratin, and it's the same material that our hair and our fingernails are made out of. And every year, that animal will add another layer of keratin to the exterior of those horns. So they don't grow a brand new set of horns every year, they just add to the length of the horns that they already have. And that's why if you get a very mature bighorn ram, for example, can have horns that curl almost in two spirals around its head, and that is a good indicator whether or not an animal is a young animal or a mature animal. Again, horns grow from the inside out and they have a bony core. Antlers are the exact opposite. Antlers, like this one I have here, this is actually an antler that I found last winter that was shed by a white-tailed deer in my area. I was very fortunate to find this because even with the number of deer that we have in our area, you don't normally find antlers a lot, and I'll talk about that in just a minute as to why. But this antler, I don't know if you can hear that, is made of bone. And the bone is nourished during its growth pattern by a thin layer of skin and short fur that covers the exterior that's loaded with blood vessels. So that brings all of the minerals and the calcium, like I mentioned when we looked at the videos, to the site of antler growth, and that nourishes the antler. So when the velvet dies and begins to split and peel back from the antlers, that's why when we watched in the video that daytime shot of the buck that was just shedding his velvet, his antlers were red, and that's because the skin was starting to die back. It had split, those blood vessels within it had ruptured before they died off, and that blood stained the antler red. Now, as time goes on, of course, that will be worn off when they rub their antlers on trees or use them to make scrapes, or when they're challenged by another buck and they're trying to determine dominance in their territory, they'll become polished. And a lot of times they will look like this one. Now this one's a little bit sun bleached. Normally they're a slightly bit darker than this. This one's very light ivory because it was out in the sun, I think, for a little bit before I found it. And in our area, whitetail bucks will shed their antlers anywhere from mid to late February all the way up through into April. I have seen on trail camera footage from our area whitetail bucks that still have a full set of both antlers from the previous breeding season. So once those antlers drop, almost immediately the next set begin to grow. And there's two specialized areas on the top of a buck's skull, right above its ears, one on each side, that looks like a little flat disc area. If you were to peel back the layers of muscle and skin, and I apologize I don't have a deer skull here for you, I should have thought this through better, but hey, that's another program. We'll talk about skulls. You can see those little flat areas where the antlers grow, and if you look at the base of this one, you can see those bony ridges in there, and it feels quite rough. It almost feels like sandpaper. That's where this antler connected to that specialized bony pad on the skull, and those pads are called pedicels, and that is the base of antler growth every year for a male deer, a buck. So this antler, like I said, I found last winter, and it's a respectable sized one. It's a little small for our area, but it is very nicely formed. It's got 5 beautiful points on it, or tines, and it's pretty typical of what you'd find. Now, I don't want to begin to try to age this deer based on the antler alone. There's a lot of things that determine antler growth, but the two main ones are genetics of the deer, whether or not genetically they are predisposed to grow a larger set of antlers based on their DNA. But the flip side of that coin is also nutrition. What kind of habitat is that deer living on? What kind of access to food does it have all year round, especially during the mid to late summer when those antlers are, charging into their final set of growth before it's time for the breeding season and the velvet dies back and the antler growth is complete. So you can have a buck that has really good genetics, predisposing it to growing larger antlers, but if it's on poor habitat, they might get a nice shaped set of antlers like these, but they might not be as large as they would if it was on better habitat. In my area, the bedrock underneath the soil, the underlying layer of rock beneath the soil is limestone, and that's very good for animals like deer that grow antlers. Those minerals and that calcium from the limestone, as it naturally begins to break down, are absorbed up into the plants that grow in that area. That gets drawn up into things like the acorns or the hickory nuts that the deer might eat. It gets drawn up into the plants that they browse on during the summer, like greenbrier, other plants like that. And it adds minerals and calcium that are conducive to antler growth. So if you get a deer that has great genetics and it's on excellent habitat where you have a good supply of minerals and calcium in its diet, then it's going to grow antlers to its full potential. Now, seeing whitetail bucks on my property really makes me excited, not because I hunt, but if they get used to the fact that there is no hunting pressure on our property, there's a very good chance that they're going to hang around and stay on this property because they're not being disturbed. Well, okay, except for the naturalist that comes tromping through a few times a week checking her SD cards and her camera. But other than that, there's really nobody out here. So that may encourage them to stay. That's why I put the mineral block out, obviously for video purposes, but not because I want to hunt, but to provide an extra source of nutrients for the deer and other wildlife that come onto my property. And the hope is that if these animals stay in this area, they stay here through the breeding season, and they continue to stay once the breeding season is over, there's a possibility I might be able to find more of these natural treasures out in my woods once that breeding season is over. And breeding season for white-tailed deer, or rut, you may hear some people refer to it as rut. The rutting season in our area is anywhere usually from mid-October until end of November, mid-December at the very latest. That seems to be the main point, with November being the kind of high point of the rut in our area. So as we get into the end of November, the beginning of December, I'm going to start looking around maybe to see if I can find some more antlers, because I love these as teaching tools. This is something that the buck grows every year. It drops naturally every year. So collecting an antler from your property is a great way to get a teaching tool that you can show people a little bit of the wild and have a great visual aid to use, but does not cause any harm to the deer itself. Now, I mentioned we have a lot of deer in our area, so you would think, oh, well, with the amount of deer, you've probably got antlers stacked up to your eyeballs. Well, that's not true. The reason these are so hard to find is because not only are antlers fun for people to collect, antlers are wildlife gold for a lot of other species. A lot of animals, especially rodents like squirrels and chipmunks and mice, will feed on antlers, because all of that calcium and these minerals that are locked up in the antlers during their growth, once these antlers are shed, this is like a mineral block for these other species. So they will come in and nibble on these antlers to get those minerals and that calcium for themselves so they can use them in their own bodies. And it's amazing how quickly an antler like this, if I left it in the woods, would be broken down by the local wildlife. In fact, if I can find some antlers this winter, I'm probably going to chain one to a tree and put one of my cameras on it and try to do some time lapse and see how long it takes, how many species of animals to come in and turn this into just a little tiny chunk of bone left over. I'm super excited to do that, so that's another project I will do. But anyway, that's a very short answer version of why our deer looked the way it did in the video and how antlers grow. Again, if you have any wildlife questions, whether it's more about deer or any other wildlife in my neck of the woods, or just a nature question in general, questions about me, questions about my business, please don't hesitate to leave them in the comments for this video. Please like the videos if you do. Hit that subscribe button, and don't forget to hit that bell so you'll be notified when I put out new content. Keep on watching. Thanks for looking in today, and we'll talk to you soon. Bye, everybody.